Hello there friends, I hope you're still surviving and welcome back to episode 5 of
Concept Limbo,
the series where I ask such questions as what happens when an unbreakable phone meets an immovable object, and can you catch anything from using a slingshot made out of a second-hand mankini? So far in our strip search of the Rust devblogs, community updates and Trello boards, we've shone a light on what happened to such incredible concepts as the caretakers, handcuffs, horse riding, fishing rods and vehicles, and in the previous 2 episodes we fully explored the subject of weaponry, so if you haven't watched them yet then I'd really recommend it. You'll learn a lot. No, seriously, you will. Anyway, in this part I thought it'd be a good idea to stop and take a look at something that gives us an insight into the inner workings of the brains behind Rust. Yes, my diary. No, only joking, I'm talking about Gary Newman's mind map. So come with me as we journey to the outer limits of inner space and travel back in time to December of 2014, where on devblog number 38 he said,
"People are constantly asking for a roadmap for Rust. I'm not a fan of the traditional roadmap. I don't want us to feel tied down to features and timescale. We're hobbyists at heart. We're not a game factory. We don't need that kind of pressure."
He then explained why, rather than a linear roadmap of features, a mind map better suited Rust's style of development.
It allows us to see our grand plan on a single screen, to jot down our ideas in a logical way. It doesn't have the same pressures as a traditional roadmap. There's no dates, no times. If we change something, we can follow the tree and see what else it affects.
Yes, you see, Rust is a very organic affair. It grows like a rampant moss, spreading and changing to suit the terrain, rather than being engineered from a rigid set of blueprints. That's not to say there isn't a plan, it's just that, as Gary said, he doesn't like being tied to linear roadmaps, which is probably why he ended up giving us one at the end of 2015. Not that we're on schedule with it at all, but that's another story for another time. Anyway, this is Gary's mind map, and although it may look like some sort of extraterrestrial spider fell from a great height onto a sheet of graph paper, it is in fact a freeze frame of the features that Gary envisioned Rust as having eventually, at least at the time it was made. I'd like to make clear though that because Rust never sleeps and the goalposts are constantly changing, you shouldn't take anything here as set in stone. That being said, however, I have regularly checked it in the months since it was first mentioned, and although it has shown no signs of having been updated for a very long time, and there's no reason to believe that Gary even refers to it anymore, I have noticed more and more ideas from it slowly being introduced into Rust, and so I wanted to show you what it has to say, as I'm sure you'll find it enlightening. I'll also put a link to it in the video description so you can pore over it at your leisure. Phew, where to start? Well, why don't we begin with the branch marked priority and see what was at the forefront of Gary's to-do list at the end of 2014, shall we? First and foremost, we have stone should appear as part of world rocks, presumably meaning that you'd be mining from this instead of from these. Well, that hasn't happened yet, sadly, but it's not exactly what I'd call a game changer, so no skin off my nose. We do have a variety of weather conditions now, including rain, snow and fog, which is good. Sounds like a typical day in Britain. And everything that you can build is now destroyable, but not all of it is repairable. As for metabolism, we've had blood loss and cold effects for quite a while now, and since recent updates, exhaustion does occur as a byproduct of dehydration, so I think we can consider this one pretty much done. On to the next major limb of the map now, called strategies, and first up on the list is the steamy topic of base security. Now, traps are something we have a couple of, namely the bear and mine variety, but here's a thought: how about separate triggers that could be linked to your defences? Gary's ideas for these included both pressure pads and PIR, and in case you're wondering, PIR stands for passive infrared, and that may make you think of this, which would be wrong, because this is actually what's called active infrared and is triggered whenever an object such as a hand, leg or any other body part interrupts the beam. Passive infrared looks more like this and is a sensor that detects changes in infrared radiation, from body heat for instance, and can detect your very presence in the space that it's guarding. Something like this would certainly make it harder for any unauthorized ninja to sneak around your base, especially if it could be attached to some kind of alarm system, but what if you were offline? Well, the solution could lie in the next branch down, push notifications. What this basically means is that if an alarm was triggered, or maybe a loud noise such as C4 or a chainsaw was heard by your sleeping Newman, a message could potentially be fired through Steam to an app on your phone, and you could rush home from work, carefully of course, to defend your base, or more than likely discover that you've respawned on a beach. Don't hold your breath for this one, but it's interesting that at least Gary has thought about the possibility. Below this we have building-based weapons, which of course we now have in the shape of the auto turret, but notice the idea of perhaps being able to attack neighbouring buildings. I'm assuming some sort of manual turret or ballista would be required here, perhaps even something like a larger version of that mortar cannon concept we were shown on Devblog 98. If so, it could be powerful but expensive to use, and you'd need to calculate the arc much like a rusty version of Angry Birds. Next we have better weapons, which we've seen a lot of progress on. For instance, we now have all of the weapon mods from Legacy and more, although Gary wanted to push this even further with some sort of reloading system and even free view aiming, which according to the attached note he'd already partially worked out how to do. We can throw just about everything now, although using your rock to test pressure pads or tossing your meat at a bear to act as a distraction could be interesting. Moving down to better building, we've got plenty of signs to scroll on now, but what would make our bases better than reskinnable building parts? Imagine the possibilities. Well, actually you don't even have to flex your imagination, because we were shown an example of what they could look like on Devblog 82 in October last year, where Vince gave us a glimpse of something he'd been working on.
I also made some interior building blocks to support building skins, some basic wallpaper and carpet floor textures. The idea is to empower you guys into making your base interior look the way you want it to be. This is just the first pass on this. It shouldn't be that hard to implement, as we split interior and exterior parts of our walls. What I did here is really just to facilitate Gary's work for when we get this done.
Well, it might not have been that hard to implement them, and our walls might now have interior and exterior sides, but yeah, hopefully these are still kicking around somewhere and we'll get to do a bit of home decor one day. Moving on to the subject of better animals, and I think there's some fairly obvious things that would improve them, but which we'll talk about in just a moment. Here though, Gary felt that perhaps a wider blind spot in the rear and being able to stealth them more easily would help a lot. Under spotting probability, there's some notes on circumstances that would make it harder for animals to detect players, such as crouching. Better clothing was also on his mind, and by better he didn't just mean amazingly sexy skins. No, he was thinking of clobber that would bestow extra abilities and have an actual function. Now, we've already got clothing that blocks cold and a set that mitigates radiation. Not that there's any point to that at the moment, but just have a look at the others. There's underwater breathing, something that was actually explored in concept art back in November 2014, and there have been repeated threats to add more purpose to Rust's underwater environment since, such as remnants and sunken wrecks, so hopefully we'll be able to boldly go there one day. Blocking fire damage would certainly be more relevant now with our newly acquired flamethrowers, even if it was just to protect our own eyebrows, and something that makes sense if you ask me is that clothing, especially footwear, could change your movement speed. I know I move a lot faster when I have a new set of shoes, and don't even get me started on Go Faster stripes. The last point is an intriguing one, and the attached note gives a bit more insight, that perhaps certain clothing could boost selected abilities. For example, engineer overalls could shorten crafting times, lumberjack jackets could give you more wood, and a butcher's apron? What's an apron? Could give you more and better cuts of meat. Perhaps a chef's hat could unlock those pie recipes we need. I mean, come on, every game needs hats. Lastly, there's bonus to healing. Perhaps he was thinking of something like this. I wouldn't put it past him. Anyway, moving over to the other side of the map now and continuing our journey anti-clockwise, we have a branch called Requests with one lonely node entitled Punish Self-Inflicted Deaths. No details as to what that might include, whether he meant some sort of cooldown, which we kind of have now with sleeping bags, or whether you could stand to lose some XP, say, every time you suicide, when that system's introduced, of course. I don't know, and we'll just have to wait and see. Now we come to probably the most exciting branch of the map, Future Ideas, which is divided into definitely and maybe sections. Let's just look at maybe to start with. First of all, we have Prone, something that I'd like to see, something that I think a lot of players would like to see, and although it's down on here as a maybe, I was positive I saw Gary mention it recently, so I checked, and sure enough, on Ask.fm on March 1st of this year, someone asked him,
"Are there any plans to make personage could crawl? Supposed to crawl in the ride or shoot from the roof on his stomach?"
I'm not sure why someone would have a roof on their stomach, maybe to keep their beer gut dry, I don't know. Anyway, Gary very eloquently replied,
"Yeah."
Well, that's nice. Under that, we have Steam persistent blueprints for item variants, tradables and clothes, which we do now have. And finally, get this, natural disasters such as earthquakes and tornadoes. It was only a maybe, remember, but imagine racing to upgrade your twig cottage with something like this bearing down on you. Now to what Gary definitely wanted Rust to have, at least in December 2014 when this was released to us, and at the top, controller input and console research. Hopefully at some point in the future, Rust will come to consoles and the player base will increase dramatically. Next, bare hands, and on the previous episode I spoke about concepts for using our fists in combat, but how about actually carrying things around? Being able to pick up deployables, for instance, could let you rearrange your furniture, or even someone else's, perhaps running away with their chests to smash them open at home. A plan for deployables to have their own physics and fall with gravity could be interesting too. Carrying explosives and siege weapons was also something I touched on in the last episode, with the concept for a payday-type drill for raiding that had to be lugged around two-handed and guarded while it did its dirty work. And an addition that I'd really like to see, and something that would add an extra dimension to combat, as well as helping out massively on medieval roleplay servers, is being able to carry items defensively. Think shields. Whether it's a heavy riot shield that's strong as a horse but slows you down, or just something janky and wooden that we can paint our clan logo on, I don't care, just give them to us already. The weather cycle section is pretty much in game now, with fog, sound, catchable rain and metabolism effects all in force, although again extreme weather damaging buildings is mentioned, even though tornadoes were in the maybe section. Water recently became much more important, and with the ability to drink from rivers and lakes being added, most of this section is now in. We only have wells and springs to go, but with a water pump being modelled, this is all under control. Now, something that's puzzled me for a long time is why we can't use notes yet. They're in the game and we certainly have the ability to paint and draw on stuff, but they're useless right now, and that makes me sad. On a side note, the latest community blog showcased one player's habit of using maps as notes and leaving them on sleeping players, so maybe this is all we can do for now. Mining comes next, with importing and exporting, interestingly, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. Then metal refining, but as we now have HQ metal as a resource, this may be covered. Farming is looming large on the agenda right now, and picking, planting, feeding, watering and growing is all to be expected as part of that, but animals and beehives in particular are an interesting idea. Imagine having an army of trained killer bees as a base defense, and with honey in abundance, we could start making mead. Vehicles were the subject of the entirety of episode 2 of this series, so I'm not going to go overboard here, but as you can see, boats, cars, planes, siege weapons and horses were all in the definitely pile. Something I'd like to point out again with the boats though is this idea of server transitioning with them and importing and exporting between servers. It had a mixed reception when I mentioned it last time, and I can understand why. It wouldn't be fair to be able to go from a modded server with 20 times gather, for argument's sake, to a vanilla server, and to be honest, I can't see this being allowed. I should think if it ever was a thing, then there'd be some definite restrictions in place. I was kind of fascinated by the mention of Vandelay Industries, and I wasn't sure what on earth Gary was going on about here at first, but that's apparently because I've never really watched Seinfeld. I know, shoot me. In the programme, Vandelay Industries was a fictional company that dealt in selling latex, and I can only imagine that Gary either intends for us to sell rubber goods to each other, or that it's just shorthand for the possibility of player-run businesses springing up around the whole importing and exporting mechanic. Talking of which, if you look at the next node down, there are more details about this, including the concept of specialist servers that had an abundance of certain resources. For instance, animals could go extinct on your island, so you'd need to go to another to repopulate. User-created content is something we're used to now, but something that would be very cool indeed is the ability to make custom maps and upload them to the Steam Workshop. Finally on this branch, achievements. Not sure what these would be. Maybe going for a full 20 minutes without being KOS'd should be one. I don't know. Leave me a suggestion. The last section of the mind map deals with bugs, and there's only one here that I particularly want to point a hoof at, and that is the amazing ability of animals to walk through stuff without being banned for hacking. Notice please though, the most important point, that this was not considered urgent. And I have a feeling that that's one thing that still hasn't changed. I shall leave you with a montage of animals walking through things while I say thank you for liking, subscribing and sharing this video. Check out the rest of the series and come and pay me a visit on Twitch, Twitter, Facebook and Steam. And I shall catch you all very soon. In the meantime, stay rusty. Cheerio.